Well, hello, church. Happy Thanksgiving weekend to each of you. Hey, there are some weekends where it's a little bit easier to say it is indeed better to be like one day in the house of the Lord than 1,000 elsewhere. And tonight just feels like one of those moments. It's better to be here than anywhere else we could be tonight. It is so good to worship with each of you. As has been mentioned, today we begin a brand new series where we will be walking through the whole book of Daniel, one chapter at a time. The book of Daniel is an amazing book. It's also a really unique book. It's for a whole host of reasons. It's written in a couple of different languages, if you like to read it in the original languages. It has a couple of different genres. It's broken down into two totally major parts, which is why we've broken our walk through the book of Daniel into two separate parts. Today we start looking at the stories or the narrative in the book of Daniel, where we see God's faithfulness. God shows up, God shows out. And then the second part, if you want a fancy little phrase, it's called apocalyptic literature. And we're going to be looking at what that means as well in the new year. Part one, today, unwavering, where we're going to be looking at the stories of Daniel. And specifically, what does it mean to live an unwavering life of faith? Why do we choose the book of Daniel? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and I think we will all come to see those reasons in the weeks that lay before us. One of them is we want to learn how God has worked in the past, because God still works. He has not changed yesterday, today, forever. He's the same. If we learn how he's moved in the past, we can learn to look for him in the present. One of them is because apocalyptic literature can be hard to understand. And we as a church want to learn to read God's word well. And third, and perhaps most particular for today and for today's message, is this. The book of Daniel takes place in a location and a time when God's people have been scattered, exiled, they've been removed from their home and are forced to figure out how to live a life of faith in a new place. For centuries, God's people had lived in the promised land, a place where God's rules were the rules of the land. God's values were the value of the city. The culture was oriented in many ways around God. And now in the book of Daniel, God's people have been exiled and they have to figure out how to live faithfully in a new place with a different kind of culture, with a different kind of value system. Sound familiar? I'm not sure Canada was ever like a thoroughly Christian nation, if we think about it in that kind of language. But I do know this, and people younger than me, you're going to find this really shocking. People my age or older, you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. When I was growing up, everything was closed on Sundays. Everything. There was no sports. The stores were closed, the grocery stores were closed, restaurants were closed. You know, some of the most committed Christians here are like, man, that sounds super inconvenient, right? Everything was closed on Sundays because it was the Lord's Day. It was like, you couldn't do anything on Sundays. Everything was closed. Now, we don't live there anymore. Things have changed. Or anyone here familiar with what used to be called the Hays Code? The Hays Code. It was in authority and in place until the 1960s. The Hays Code was an authoritative set of rules for any production company that wanted to put anything on TV or anything out in media. They were in place until the 1960s, all kinds of rules about what could be shown on TV, what couldn't be shown on TV. Rules about alcohol, rules about dancing, language, sex, sexuality, all these things. One of the rules for every TV program that would ever go out was that married couples could not be shown in the same bed because it was too risky. And if for the absolute necessity of the program, if you had to show a married couple in bed, one of their feet had to be firmly planted on the ground. I don't know if you've turned a TV on recently, but we don't live there anymore. We have to figure out, how do we live unwavering lives of faith in a place, in a culture, in a world that is vastly different and changing. And for the vast majority of Canada's 156 years of existence, there was a negligible difference between popular societal ethics, priorities, vision for what it means to be human, and values, and what the church believed. There was very little difference for the vast majority of those years. But now, there's quite a difference between the broader cultural values and priorities and what the church may have to say about those things. And I would say the more serious we are about following the way of Jesus, the larger that gap may be. It's hard for followers of Jesus to figure out how to live an unwavering life of faith right now. Some capitulate to culture, some try to assimilate and feel a part of it. Some have tried to just run away from it and hide and live in cocoons, little bubbles of safety with people that look, think, act, believe the same. And as a church, we don't want to capitulate. We don't want to assimilate. We don't want to run away. We want to learn, how do we live unwavering right here, right now, for the sake of our King in this world. So how do we do that? Well, that's what we're looking at these next several weeks in the book of Daniel. Sound good? Sound needed? All right, today's Daniel chapter 1. Here's some background as we make our way through Daniel. The year is 606 BC. God's judgment has been extended towards his people because they were living lives of idolatry. They weren't following God's teaching. And the result of this choice on God's people was that the big bad Babylonians came. One of the greatest empires the world had ever known. They descended upon God's people in Jerusalem and took over. Now, rather than destroy Jerusalem at that time, rather than destroy it, they put a puppet king in place, and they took a bunch of God's, the best and the brightest from God's city, from Jerusalem, and they brought them back to Babylon. And Daniel 1 is a picture of how Babylon, this empire, took God's people, brought them to their land, and tried to brainwash them out of their unwavering faith and into fitting the mold of that dominant culture. And in case you haven't heard this lately, hear this again today. The world around us is still trying to brainwash us out of an unwavering faith and into a mold to fit the broader culture, to adjust our affections, to shape our desires. And if we want to live unwavering lives, we must pay attention to this process. So here's what we read, Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Okay, I just want us to see something really quick in those first 2 verses. In verse 1, it says, King Neb, he won the war, he took over Jerusalem. That makes sense, right? Reading verse 1 is reading plain history. There was a war, there was winners, there was losers. But then in verse 2, I don't know if you caught it, but there's a shift. It's the same story with a different perspective. Verse 2 starts off by saying, the Lord delivered Jehoiakim into his hand. King Neb and his crew may have thought they won, but really the Lord delivered his people into his hand. Verse 1 describes what just took place on a historical level. Verse 2, there's faith, a part of the storytelling, to acknowledge there is a sovereign Lord behind everything in this world. King Neb didn't win. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim. And in our lives, every single one of us, We have a choice. We can look at our circumstances. We can look at our surroundings. We can look at our lives and just see what's happening and saying, oh, that's the way it is. I'm in exile. I lost. I'm being treated poorly. This is awful. Or we can take hold of the promises of God and by faith choose to look at what's going on in our lives and say, what is God doing here? Why is God doing this? God, where are you in this situation? The first step to living an unwavering faith in exile is learning to look at the world around us properly. When we look for God, we will find him. And when we find him, we can join him. The story continues on. And it says this, verse 3, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. All right, that explains the brainwashing process of Babylon. And the first thing that we see in this brainwashing process is that God's people are isolated. God's people are isolated. King Nebuchadnezzar took Daniel and the crew 900 miles away from their home, and he took them down to the promised land. Took them from the promised land and into Babylon. He took them away from the 3 most important things: their land, their temple, and their law, their customs. And he brought them to Babylon. Really what we read at the very beginning here when King Neb took these guys is he was trying to take the Israel out of them too and to replace it with Babylon. And so we should be aware that one of the first tactics to dismantle unwavering faith is to isolate us. If we want to live an unwavering life of faith, we will refuse to be isolated away from community. We will refuse to be removed from worship, refuse to be removed from the value system, which means when we gather here, when we worship, when we gather in community to glorify God, to bless each other, this is a declaration of war on Babylon's brainwashing. This is us saying, we will not let you isolate us from the Lord's house. You will not isolate me from God's people. Like, I am here because I need to worship God with my church family. I'm here because I need to surrender my schedule to the Lord, to submit myself to him. And hopefully by showing up and worshiping with you and talking and connecting and worshiping God together, we can mutually bless and encourage each other as we are in the house of the Lord together. Which is why I think church shouldn't just be an option among other options on the weekend. I think that's why God's word says, don't neglect gathering. And pastorally, I feel like I can say this to you all tonight because you're here. You know, you might say it to everyone who's not here, but to you who are in the room, preaching to the choir, you're here on Thanksgiving, you're committed. So with nothing but love, maybe a little bit of spiciness, I say, don't neglect gathering as the church. Don't neglect being together to worship the Lord. Don't neglect community. I heard recently that the national average for regular attenders to be in church is 1.7 times a month. Now, I will say that number makes sense if we think going to church is to get something. If we think showing up here is just to get something, to be fed, if it's just showing up because there's an appetite or a desire, that number makes sense, right? There's an average time people go to the fridge. Why? To get fed. So, hey, I'm hungry, I'm gonna go. If we just think this is about getting something and getting fed, then we're missing that this is an anti-Babylon brainwashing formation process. Showing up here is a part of our formation where we surrender our conveniences, we surrender our luxuries, we surrender our time to say, Lord Jesus, I'm showing up because I love you and because I want to be formed by your word more than any other word. That's why we show up here. To be formed in the way of Jesus and not be malformed by distractions. If we want to have an unwavering faith that lasts, we need to be in the Lord's house so that we can learn to take that faith to our house, wherever it may be. This is a formation practice. Surrendering to him. Babylon isolates these folks, and then the next thing we read is after they were isolated, we read that they were taught for 3 years the language and the literature of Babylon. All right, step 1, isolation. Step 2, indoctrination. 3 years, learn the language, learn the literature. Send them to college, no summer breaks though, okay? That's the kind of time period we're talking about here. Babylon's like, we need to train their minds to think differently. We need to reform their stories of origin. We need to overwrite the things that they have learned. We have to give them the new narratives of how the world works. Let's rewrite their memories. Let's take over the legacy of faith that they're holding on to from Israel. And I think if we aren't careful, this still happens in our world. I think, in many ways, the tactic Babylon put on these guys with language and literature is most felt for us with media and social media. That's something that's forming how we view this world, forming the way we think, forming what we look at. Like, let's not trick ourselves. Everything we watch, everything we listen to, everything we tolerate adjusts how we think. Was it C.S. Lewis who said every creature, every human is slowly becoming more Christ-like or more, I can't remember what adjective he used, but like Satan-like? Everything forms us. Are we intentionally aware of what we're taking in, of the literature and the language that we're using, of what we're hearing? What we look to, what we take in, what we watch and listen to shapes us. It shapes our world, it shapes how we think, and it shapes what we believe. You know, if someone broke into my house and took my kids, I would do all kinds of drastic things to try and get them back. I would be very concerned for my beloved little Trigglets, you know? I would chase after them. But if we aren't careful, our devices and our media consumption is taking our kids away. It's also taking us away from ourselves and stripping the humanity from us if we're not careful. It's fragmenting relationships and fragmenting lives. We have to be aware of the language and the literature that we take in. Now, I will say this, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Daniel didn't refuse to learn the language and literature. He's still engaged in the world, but we have to be careful with what we do and how we allow that to permeate our souls. We have to be aware of that. At first it was isolation, then it was indoctrination. The third tactic that we see the Babylonians doing to David and to the crew is we see gratification. And picture this moment for Daniel and the guys. Picture this moment for all of the folks from Israel, right? They have just been defeated in war. And the army comes in and they say, you are coming with me. And so there's all these people from Israel. They're getting dragged 900 miles away from their family, 900 miles away from everything they knew, largely through the desert. Then all of a sudden they're walking like, is that a mirage out in the distance? Like, oh, no, that's where we're going. And they see Babylon off in the distance. Maybe they see some like shapes forming and they get a little bit closer and a little bit closer. And eventually maybe they start seeing some palm trees. They get a little bit closer. Maybe there's some fountains of water. The gates open up. Daniel and the crew, after this massive trek through the desert, they walk in and there's the Babylonian hanging gardens. Whoa, I've never seen anything like this. King Nebuchadnezzar, you built these? And then these guys are ushered right into the king's court. And what happened? The king's like, here's a free buffet. Here's an open bar. Help yourself. Here's a job. Here's a free pension. It's a government job. Like, here you go. Take it. It's for you. We're told Daniel was 15 at this time. What kind of 15-year-old can resist that? Mom and dad are a light year away and there's an open bar from the king? They're offered everything. Everything. And one of the things I've learned from my personal failure, one of the things I've learned observing it many times over, is that health, wealth, and gratification wean us away from desperately depending on the Lord. The more comfortable we are, the harder it is to have a desperate desire for the Lord. It's hard to live a life of unwavering faith when everything we need for survival hardly takes faith at all. Babylon's like, here's everything you could need. Gratified life, there you go. I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen this. Calgary was listed the 7th best city on planet Earth to live in. The 7th best city on planet Earth. Now, I know there's a lot of complexities in this room, but if we don't think we're at risk of losing a desperation and a desperate dependency on the Lord, then we are being brainwashed. We live in one of the greatest places on earth. That's not me. I didn't come up with that. You can look it up. And health and wealth have a way of weaning us from dependency on the Lord. The gifts of God in this place, in this city, they're wonderful. I love Calgary. But we need to be aware of the shadow side risks. Isolation, indoctrination, gratification. There's one more, and I think it's most personal. Once they've gone through all these things, the final point of attack on them is their identification. We read about Daniel, Mishael, Hananiah, Azariah. We read about them being brought into the king's court. They're immersed in this regime. And then we read in verse 7 that the chief official gave them new names. So first, before we look at the new names, look at what their original names meant. Daniel, it meant God is my judge. Mishael, who is what God is? What a line. Hananiah, Yah has been gracious. And that Yah is for Jehovah. It's where we get hallelujah. Yah has been gracious. And then Azariah, Yah has helped. So Daniel, Mishael, they end in El for Elohim. God is in their name. It's in the nature of their existence. Hananiah, Azariah, Jehovah. He has been gracious to me. God was put right into their name. And can't you just picture these young men running through the streets of Jerusalem and their parents are like, Daniel! And Daniel's like, God is my judge. They knew what their names meant, and it was meant to speak something into who they were. And these guys are brought into the king's court, and the guy's like, okay, so what's your name? And Daniel's like, God is my judge. And then Mishael, who is what God is? And they go on, and then the judge, the Babylonian's like, oh, interesting, 4 different gods. Fascinating. And then they're like, no, don't get it twisted. All of those are the one God. He's our judge. He's gracious. He helps. There is no one like him. And then Babylon, we got to change their names. Here's what their names are changed to. Daniel, God is my judge. His name gets changed to Belteshazzar, which means lady, protect the king. Mishael, who is what God is, to Meshach, I am of little account. Hananiah, Yah has been gracious. No, now you're Shadrach and you're scared of him. He's not gracious, you're scared. And then Azariah, Yah has helped. No, not anymore, Azariah. Now you're Abednego. Why? Because you are serving our God now. And we see them mocking the God-centered names that were given to them from their parents when they ran the streets of Jerusalem. Changing a name wasn't just rearranging letters in their name. It was an indictment on their history. They were trying to dismantle the story of God and distinguish the story of their faith. It was an attempt to say, you are not those people anymore. Now you are this person. And these names are just direct mockeries of the promise of God. I can't really imagine that doing much for Daniel, though, or any of these guys, because they knew who they were. Azariah grew up hearing his whole life, Yah has helped you. Yah has helped you. Yah has helped you. Yah has helped you. And he knows what that means. And so the Babylonians can call him whatever they want. They can put any label they want on him, but it's not going to stick. Because they knew who they were. Because they heard it every time their name got called in their upbringing. And so parents, tell your kids who they are before someone else does. Tell your kids who they are, because someone else is going to try to. Speak into them. And if you think it's too late, let me just promise you, it's never too late. I started crying during worship because I was reminded of a moment when my parents, when I was 13, took me away. And sitting on the river in Banff, my dad sits me down. And he's like, Kyle, there's a whole lot of world coming at you. And I want you to know one thing. I never want you to forget who you are or whose you are. And they're going to hate that I'm doing this. My parents are here. And so I've never done this. They're going to hate it. Can you guys stand? I just want to honor you guys. Stand. I will never forget who I am and whose I am. And by that, they meant like, you're God's child, but you're also ours. And every person in here, if you have kids, tell them, because someone else is going to try to. If you have a spouse, tell them who they are, because someone else will want to. If you have a friend, tell them who they are before someone else repeatedly tries to do that. And if you don't have anyone to tell you who you are, let me just say it tonight. You are God's child, and he loves you. And he needs you in this world because he created you. Speak truth into the people around you, or the world's lies will be louder. Babylon wants to put all kinds of labels on us. Maybe it's needed, maybe it's unneeded, maybe it's broken, maybe it's valuable, maybe it's boring, maybe it's exciting, rich, poor, hot, not, cool, cruel, I don't know. But there's all kinds of labels that want to be put on us, and the only one that matters, the only one that will help us make our way living an unwavering faith is the one that God created us. We are his. You are his. Babylon tried isolation, indoctrination, gratification, identification. They didn't work for these guys. So how do we learn to remain unwavering? Daniel 1 teaches us this. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, their old names, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. And to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. He could then speak into the culture. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. How did Daniel and his crew not compromise? How did they remain unwavering? It's the first 3 words of verse 8. But Daniel resolved. Daniel drew a line in the sand saying, I will not compromise this. I can leave my home. I can learn the things in the king's court. I can learn a new language. I can read some books, but I can't do this. Teenage Daniel, I am not compromising this. What kind of person can maintain that level of conviction 900 miles away from home? The kind of person that knows there is a king in heaven that supersedes any earthly king. When you have the right view of history, when you have the right view of reality, knowing who the real king is. Do you have lines you're unwilling to cross? Can I just suggest the heat of the moment isn't the time to choose? Middle of the night isn't the time to make moral deliberations. Choose now who you will serve. I want us to notice that God intervened only after Daniel took a step of faith. Up until this point, Daniel was just there, learning these things, involved in this world, taken away. But after Daniel put his faith into action, God moved and gave them some ability and capacity to withstand what they were facing. And if we want to live an unwavering faith, we must draw a line too that we're not willing to cross. And we must stick to it. Why did Daniel draw the line there? We don't know. I think it's reasonable to say, I can learn all kinds of things, I can be involved in all kinds of things, but I will be nourished by nothing other than God's way in my life. I'm not going to allow that to nourish and sustain my life. This is my silent protest. Man does not live on bread alone, but on the words that come from the Lord's mouth. I'm going to limit my luxuries to remain dependent on the Lord. Maybe that's why he didn't take their food. But Daniel drew a line. Have you? I want to end with this. One of the really fascinating realities with God and with the stories that we read in the Bible is how often it seems like he lost right before something happens. You know, Daniel in Babylon, they lost the war. They're dragged really far away. God's people were taken captive. It looks like God lost. If you want a really interesting Bible exercise this week, go and read the story of Joseph and look at how that overlaps with this story with Daniel. Dragged away, foreign land, treated bad. God gives the capacity for dreams and visions, gives him favor with the king, gives him a leadership role. But it also looked like God lost with Joseph, right? Dragged away, thrown in jail, treated poorly. Looks like God lost. Go back a few years. Go to Joseph's great-grandpa, Abraham. What's really interesting is that Abraham was actually in the land of Babylon, running away, wandering around. And what happens? God finds him, and what does God say to Abraham? I will make your name great. Now imagine that very place, centuries later, someone saying, Daniel, you have a new name. He's like, no, I don't, because I know what God says to my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa. God's the one who changes names. He's the one who changes identities. He's the one who changes destinies, and I'm his. You can put whatever label you want on me, but I know who I am because I know the God of reality. But it looked like God lost with Joseph. It looked like God lost with Abraham. It looked like God lost with Daniel. And we just see this reality that sometimes we may lose battles, but God will never lose the war. And he loves you. You may feel like you've lost a lot of battles, but God's saying, no. I'm the one behind the battle. And I see you. And I love you, and I'm with you, and I've never left you. I've been there. You may feel like King Nebuchadnezzar dragged you away, but here I am. And the reason we can know that that's true in a way that will change our hearts tonight is when we fast forward from a 15-year-old Daniel exiled to a foreign place. We fast forward and fast forward and fast forward to a baby that was exiled to a foreign place. Someone who gave up all the luxuries of home, all the glories of comfort, the comforts of heaven. What happens? He comes, and what? His parents give him a name that speaks the truth of who he is. His name is Jesus because he will save his people. And Jesus came to the world he created where all kinds of people were speaking identity on him, trying to indoctrinate him, trying to distract him, trying to promise him gratification, trying to promise him stature and preeminence in the land. And Jesus like, no, because I know who I am. And Jesus never compromised. And because Jesus endured all these things to their very end, even death on a cross, he now has the capacity and the authority and the ability to promise he will never leave you. And we can live unwavering lives, not because we have this bolstered faith, but because Jesus is there holding us up. He's gone before. Everything we could face. There's no temptation, no exile, no pain, no experience, no promise, no label that Jesus has not overcome. We may feel like we've lost, but Jesus promises us he will win the war. And he's with you. Will you let God speak his truth to your life today? There is no place, person or predicament you need to be afraid of, because we know the God on the throne. We may read the storyline or the news article headline, but we know the one on the throne. So maybe today is just an opportunity for you to elevate your perspective beyond reading history and be reminded there is a sovereign Lord of all who loves you and sees you and cares about you. Maybe today you're like, oh, I drew a line and I crossed it. I don't even really remember where it was. Jesus is like, I got you. Welcome home. Maybe it's just time to commit to not letting brainwashing work. You're going to commit to refusing to be isolated, refusing to be malformed by what you take in, refusing to be gratified by anything other than the word of the Lord, refusing to let anyone else speak identity into you. Just saying, I'm God's child. I know who I am and whose I am, and that's enough for me. The one thing I know is God is inviting us all to stand and to live with him. Daniel demonstrated the power of God at work in his life, and we're going to see this week over week for the next several weeks. But for today, right now, you, wherever you may be, whatever may be going on in your life, today, Jesus has come and offered his promise of his presence to be with you in exile. An unwavering faith, church, it's unbelievably possible. Jesus is with us.